everyone to our webinar, Building an American Hydrogen Market, hosted by RMI. Thank you for joining us to discuss how the US could build a globally competitive hydrogen industry that delivers economic benefits throughout the country. My name is Alexei Tatarenko, and I'll introduce myself momentarily. And in the meantime, we'll give everyone a couple of minutes to join, and then we will officially kick off. In the meantime, please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on RMI's event page within 24 hours of this event, along with other related resources. During the webinar, please feel free to drop any questions that you have into the Q&A function on your screen, and we will get to as many as we can during a live Q&A session. The webinar will be 75 minutes long. We'll start with a short presentation, and then we'll fairly quickly get into the discussion mode, and that's where most of the meet will be. So thank you again for joining us. We'll get started soon. All right. Hello and welcome to our webinar, Building an American Hydrogen Market, hosted by RMI. Thank you for joining us to discuss how the US could build a global competitive hydrogen industry that delivers economic benefits for the country. My name is Alexei Tatarenko, and I'm the hydrogen senior principal here in RMI with the Climate Aligned Industry Program. During the webinar, please feel free to drop any questions that you have into the Q&A function on your screen, and we will get to as many as we can during our live Q&A part. This webinar will be 75 minutes long. We'll begin with a short presentation by my colleague, Tessa Weiss. She will present the key findings of our recently released report titled Hydrogen Made in America for America, followed by a discussion with today's panelists, whom I will introduce after the presentation, and then Q&A session that I already mentioned. To start us with, I will say a few words about RMI. RMI, as many of you may know, is an independent, non-partisan, non-profit organization that focuses on transformation of the global energy systems through market-driven solutions to secure a clean, prosperous, zero-carbon future for all. RMI has got about 700 experts working on 4 continents, including hydrogen teams in the US, Europe, India, and China that focus on heavy industry and heavy transportation sectors. So the report that we will be discussing today is one of the series of the reports that we developed recently. And I would like to say a few words about why this report, why now, and why this webinar that we are hosting. So I'll start with saying that at RMI, we have taken a pragmatic approach in reviewing the state of hydrogen industry and in our work on hydrogen more generally, focusing on the key markets. In Europe, we recently published the report called The Case for Recalibration of European Hydrogen Strategy and hosted a similar webinar a couple of weeks ago. We will soon also release the assessment of India burgeoning hydrogen market and our assessment of what's going on in India and its export potential. And therefore, the report that we will be discussing today and the work that we've been focusing on in the US is very much, part of this global take stock effort. The report is called Made in America for America, which gives you some clues what it is focusing on. And it is very much focused on how to build a domestic market. And what stimulus will be required to make that market happen and to make that market grow. And why that's important is because we believe that this is critical to American leadership in the global hydrogen market. While we recognize that export-oriented strategy will play a significant role in the scale-up of market, particularly when it comes to low-carbon hydrogen, we also believe that there is a huge need to build a domestic market and therefore enough of capacity for liftoff in the domestic market to get the competitive edge for the United States in the global context. The belief is that a robust domestic market is foundational also to any export ambitions that the country may pursue, and therefore without scale and efficiency at home, it will be difficult to compete on cost and reliability abroad. With that short framing, I would like to hand it over to my colleague, Tessa Weiss, who is a manager on RMI hydrogen team, leading lots of our work, but in particular, Tessa was the lead author on this report and will give us a short presentation of its key insights and highlights. Tessa, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alexei. I will be diving deeper into the insights that we've found in our Hydrogen Made in America for America report. But to reiterate some of the framing that Alexei shared, we published this report really with a need to better understand what more was needed to get the United States hydrogen market going and what advantages could America realize through establishment of a strong domestic market alongside the continued development of its export-oriented market that we see having more momentum within the country at present. The report builds on RMI's deep expertise that we've established across the hydrogen and industrial decarbonization space, where we engage in sectors such as steel, maritime, shipping, and aviation, as well as have supported recently policies like the Department of Energy's Hydrogen Demand Initiative and its implementation, as well as help facilitate trade corridors across the Atlantic. The insights I'll share will be a rather high level and intended to open up many themes in which our panel discussion will dive deeper into. Hydrogen is a strategic commodity for America. It offers an opportunity to strengthen its energy leadership, its industrial base, and promote its energy security. It could ensure that the United States industrial base can remain competitive against globally shifting market conditions. It's estimated that by 2050, hydrogen could supply 15% of the world's energy and drive a $2.5 trillion market in annual revenue, which for context is roughly 70% of today's global oil and gas market revenues. However, to compete and to lead globally, the United States will need a strong market at home. And while we see that the US market continues its policy uncertainty, which drives hesitation across the industry and an overall slow start, we see that other countries are actively building markets, securing supply chains, and positioning themselves as leaders of this emergent industry. To highlight a few, we see that Europe has a coordinated approach from policies that are lowering costs, driving demand, and facilitating a rapid transition from fossil fuels. Japan is emerging as a technological and innovation leader, where its $19 billion demand-side policy is helping to drive large-scale projects, with its private sector actively pursuing ways to capture this opportunity. And we see China already dominates low-cost and at-scale electrolyzer manufacturing, championed by state-level industrial policy. Its ability to execute large capital projects and its world-class foundation of renewable resources may give it an edge in the global market. We see that establishment of a strong domestic hydrogen industry can deliver US-wide economic development, promoting new jobs, onshoring a new manufacturing base associated with this industry, as well as heightening energy security and price stability for energy consumers. The 7 federally funded hydrogen hubs are anticipated to generate over 300,000 direct and indirect jobs across construction, manufacturing, engineering, and operations. And we really see that three regions, as illustrated on this graph, can drive the majority of at least near-term growth of this industry. We see that the Gulf Coast, already as a strong energy leader in a strong industrial base, can attract billions of new investments through diversifying its energy landscape into hydrogen, continuing to promote both its export industry as well as finding ways to build up its industrial manufacturing within the region. We see that the West Coast is likely to see an increased demand for this next generation of fuels for maritime shipping, aviation, and other on-road transportation applications, and can pair an opportunity for new innovation to promote economic growth. And we see that the Midwest, as the agriculture and steel backbone of America, can facilitate rural investment and job creations through the growth of its hydrogen market. However, as we dive deeper into how this market's progressing, we notice that some of the projects with the most near-term momentum are often exports, sustainable aviation fuels, or smaller scale industrial feedstocks, and they miss a significant amount of the market opportunity found through a wider domestic application of hydrogen in heavy industry and heavy transport. This is largely because exports are backed by international policy supports that can help drive stronger economics and drive stronger demand for adoption of hydrogen. Similarly, with sustainable aviation fuels, the sector is really driven by support from downstream airlines and corporates with their voluntary corporate action targets and higher willingness to pay. We see that in really capturing a sizable domestic opportunity, finding more ways to increase competitive opportunities across the set of possible applications in the United States is essential for hydrogen. The US federal incentives, including 45V and other IRA tax credits, are really essential in driving down the costs of these new emergent technologies. RMI analysis shows that 45V and 45Y tax credits, as written in the Inflation Reduction Act, can help reduce production costs of upwards of 60% for some of the pathways like electrolysis with the lowest emissions. These tax credits have been the driving force of today's hydrogen market and have unlocked significant momentum, which will be met with outsized investment from private industry in manufacturing, energy production, and industries like steel and fertilizers, which are really core industries that can ensure that over time, private business finds opportunities for competitive production in America. We see that these credits are can drive deployments of innovative technologies like autothermal reforming, cryolysis, and electrolysis, which can help drive US technological leadership. However, we recognize that the future of these credits remains uncertain, and without these credits, the US market may look narrower in its applications and see a slower pace of scale. A cost premium would intensify for hydrogen's adoption in many of these priority sectors to drive robust growth of the market. We may continue to see an export-oriented market, largely driven by blue ammonia. However, in order to deliver these benefits across the United States and truly promote leadership on a global scale, retention of these supports as well as expansion of supports, particularly at a state level, may be required. We see that a combined approach of both supply-side incentives pairing with demand-side supports, alongside market mechanisms like booking claim systems or buyers' alliances, coupled with infrastructure supports, should be considered if the United States wants to accelerate growth in a scalable, immediate way. We see that demand-side supports are particularly important in helping to drive near-term bankability, as buyers motivated to purchase hydrogen can help provide coverage of the green premium, can drive longer-term offtake contracts, which are essential for early investments, and can increase investor comfort with early projects that may not have the operational history as they are more emergent technologies at a commercial scale. In order to help facilitate this demand, we see policy-backed supports being essential to motivate purchasing in durable, scalable ways that can move markets forward. Supports for hydrogen demand can both look like targeted demand for hydrogen as the commodity, as well as the fuels and products that hydrogen produces, like steel, aviation fuel, shipping fuel. State governments in particular can play a role in helping to develop some of these policies to motivate hydrogen's adoption. For example, we see California's low carbon fuel standards or other zero emission vehicle mandates, both in California and the West Coast broadly, helping to motivate some uptake of clean fuels that can use hydrogen. We also see sustainable aviation fuel credits in Washington, Colorado, and Minnesota are helping to drive more competitive use cases for sustainable aviation fuels. Initiatives like purchasing auctions, like the Department of Energy's Hydrogen Demand Initiative, can help close cost gaps and drive contract readiness and standardization across the market, which can help promote the ease of first transactions. Market mechanisms are well suited to complement these policies and support first mover corporates who are motivated to decarbonize and may have a higher willingness to pay to do so. These tools help address demand fragmentation, the complexity of these value chains, and the new market familiarity that the buyers we see wanting to procure these products may have. Buyers' alliances help aggregate demand into a scale that can justify production investments, and booking claim systems can connect buyers and sellers together where physical offtake options may not exist or may be otherwise complex, in providing a virtually decoupled, if you will, way to track emissions and payment of these goods. And finally, we see that infrastructure in connecting low-cost producers to users is essential to de-risking early projects, driving competitive economics, and strengthening resiliency of our hydrogen supply and our energy system at large. With that, I will pass it back to Alexi to introduce our panel.
Thank you, Tessa. And I should start with saying that with us today, we've got 4 hydrogen experts, ranging from the nonprofit space to industry and government. I'll start the introductions with Matt McMonagle, who is the CEO of Nova Hydrogen, where he brings a successful, diverse, and entrepreneurial background with nearly a decade of experience in renewable energy. Matt founded Nova Hydrogen back in 2021 to decarbonize selected areas with the industrial, transportation, and power sectors. Matt has dedicated his career to sustainable endeavors and is passionate about deploying complex and innovative technologies. Welcome, Matt. Next, I would introduce Amy Hubbard, who is the CEO and founder of Arcadia E-Fuels, a company that is dedicated to combating climate change through the production of net zero carbon sustainable fuels. With over 30 years of global industry experience, including executive leadership roles at companies such as Topsoe, Celanese, and Albemarle, Amy has a proven track record in refining, chemicals, polymer markets, including significant experience with new plant construction and expansions. She is leading Arcadia E-Fuels in the deployment of a first-of-a-kind commercial e-fuels facility in Denmark. Next, I will introduce Susan Shiflett, who serves as the Executive Director of the Texas Hydrogen Alliance and has worked in the clean fuel markets for more than 25 years. Her company, S3 Services, provides safety training, permitting assistance, and grant writing to private and public companies making the switch to cleaner, sustainable fuels. And last but not least, I would like to introduce Shannon Pressler, who leads Washington State Department of Commerce Energy Policy. She is part of the state's Office of Renewable Fuels, where she leads engagements with industry, community, and tribes to advance clean hydrogen policy initiatives, and is based in Seattle, Washington. As you can see, we've got quite a diverse set of speakers here, and I hope we will have a very lively discussion with a very diverse set of views. And to kick us off and welcome all the panelists, please jump in if you would feel compelled to contribute and build up on the points of each other, but I will start with Matt for now, and let's start with the industry views with Matt, then Amy, and then maybe we'll go to Susan and Shannon for this first round of questions. And my first question to Matt will be, Nova Hydrogen has over 3 dozen of green hydrogen projects in development across the United States with 2 gigawatts in the pipeline. We just talked about all these uncertainties which are out there. Therefore, the logical question is like, what is driving these opportunities? What is standing in their ways? What does this reveal about the broader needs in scaling the US hydrogen market? What's your view overall, Matt, on the prospects of those opportunities that are sitting in your funnel? Lots of questions, but the floor is yours.
Thanks, Alexei, and appreciate the opportunity to be on this webinar. I think probably I'm going to be a broken record throughout here, but what's standing in the way is uncertainty. And I think for me and for Novo, I founded Novo before the Inflation Reduction Act, even before the infrastructure law. And I think there are fundamental drivers and first principles that make a lot of sense in the US, and we can even say broader North America for clean hydrogen. But the policy uncertainty is horrible, for lack of a better word. It's stifling, and it's really hard to plan and make decisions with such dramatic outcomes, right? And I think the good part of 45V was that it is a significant incentive. The bad part was that, right, it took almost 2.5 years to get guidance out. And in the meantime, of course, there was an election, which went a certain way. And the news this morning of the House's bill passing, right, would, if that becomes law, would mean you have to start construction by the end of this year. Otherwise, 45V goes away. I think for us and the way that we go about market, it's so important to focus on the right use cases. And I've been saying recently that there's been a bubble with hydrogen. Great, let's burst it. There was a lot of hype that I think was frankly bad for the industry. And it's really important to focus on the right use cases. And within the US, it's roughly 10% of the global hydrogen market. Just there's plenty of demand for hydrogen. Then the question is, okay, how do we get that to clean? We can talk about that. And then we can talk about, okay, if we're going to decarbonize, which I imagine everyone on this call agrees that we need to, and it's a matter of when, not if, there will be growth in clean hydrogen use case. Let's say an e-fuel, right? Like, it doesn't make any sense to have fossil hydrogen in an e-fuel. Just use the fossil fuel, right, if you're going to do that. So there will be new use cases, steel DRI, et cetera. We can argue over what those are, but there will be new use cases. So I fundamentally don't believe there's a demand problem. I believe there's really a focus problem on going after the right applications and the right users, and tempering, I think, the hype, which has frankly caused that overexuberance. And then it's kind of crashed the other way from a pendulum perspective. And I think that rationalization is needed, but it caused a lot of harm in the interim.
And Matt, before we move on, can you crystallize what are those use cases and applications that you've talked about where you see, the highest potential?
Yeah, absolutely. So the current uses for hydrogen, I roughly like to break them into two different buckets. There's folks like ammonia refining, which are certainly a majority. They are typically big users of hydrogen. They typically have their own steam methane reformers on site. They're getting access to wholesale natural gas prices. So they're getting hydrogen at really cheap prices, let's say 50 cents to $2 a kilogram. The rest of the market is in industries like metal, glass, semiconductor, food, chemicals. Those folks are typically getting delivered via liquefaction, liquid hydrogen from off-site, and they're paying anywhere from $5 to $50 a kilogram. So there's a huge difference in what folks are paying today for fossil hydrogen. And at least for our company, the value proposition that we provide to customers is always clean, And not everyone, right? Probably most people don't really care about the green premium per se. They're not necessarily going to pay more for it. It's more a nice to have, not a must have. But then cost is super important, and then resiliency of supply. And so having a good supply on site is something that we've seen a lot of uptick with, regardless of the clean, because these are key industries where the hydrogen is a fundamental feedstock or portion of their process. They can't work without it. And it's really being used for its chemical properties, not just for energy content. It's really hard just to compete with natural gas on price in the US, even if we added a carbon price, right? Which we're not anywhere close to doing. And then, yeah, some of the new use cases where like e-fuels, we're seeing a lot of interest in, steel DRI, direct reduction of iron. And then Tessa mentioned some of the LCFS or low carbon fuel standard incentives. We are seeing heavy duty transport demand on the West Coast states in particular because of those state level programs. But we really want to focus on areas where hydrogen is the right solution. And that does matter geographically, right? You can't just say this use case over the whole world is right or wrong. You got to look at the specific constraints. But finding those right use cases, I think, is really important. Otherwise, it's so easy to get distracted and lose credibility as an industry.
That's great. Thanks, Matt. Very comprehensive and very clear. You've mentioned ESAF. Amy is here. We will zoom in into ESAF, but we will also zoom out of the US and look at what's happening in other parts of the world as Arcadia E-Fuels is developing its projects in other regions too. So my question to you, Amy, will be, as you develop these ESAF projects in UK, in the European Union, and in the United States, how do these markets compare to you as a project developer in terms of policy support, demand trends, project viability, and what specific actions you see are being needed to make US-based ESAF more competitive?
Yeah, thanks. Like I say, lots of questions in one there. So, our projects that we're developing use a lot of hydrogen. It's very intensive, and I think Matt, you mentioned, it's very sensitive to price. Our ESAF is very sensitive to price of hydrogen, and we use about 110 tons a day of hydrogen. That translates to around a 250 megawatt electrolyzer size, and we started our first project in Denmark because we thought that the regulatory environment at the time was really strong, and it still is. I think Europe has done a good job of coming out with mandates on, ESAF specifically, and so that helps drive the demand in Europe. But what Europe hasn't done is supported on, getting some of these projects off the ground in terms of subsidies. I mean, Europe definitely has a hydrogen bank, but I mean, it's very small. I mean, like 30 cents a kilogram kind of thing, kind of incentives. That doesn't help so much. So then we started looking at the US with the Inflation Reduction Act, and, the $3 per kilogram hydrogen credit is significant, and that's really helpful. Let's hope that doesn't go away. Unfortunately, the House, I guess, passed today, but there's still another step to go, so we'll see. But, with the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, it makes the project very viable that we're building. And so, if it goes away, I don't know, we'll have to reevaluate where we are. I think that in terms of, we're also developing a project in the UK, and I have to say the UK seems to have just gotten it all right. They have a hydrogen subsidy called their HAR program, hydrogen allocation round, and that's been very successful. I think, it's something on the order of, around $10 a kilogram support, so that's very significant, and it's helping get a lot of projects off the ground there. And then you translate that into ESAF and what they're doing on ESAF. They're having, also mandates in place. And so we're actually very pleased with the progress of our project in that country because, the fundamentals aren't as strong as they are in US and in Europe, but with government support, everything is possible. So I think that's really what this is about right now. We don't need government support forever, of course, but getting some of these projects off the ground as first of a kind is what we really would like to see, and that makes all the difference for us.
Thank you, Amy. I would like to go to Susan next, and then we will go to Shannon. So Susan, you're You're on the Gulf Coast, which is, of course, super well positioned to lead clean hydrogen production. And I would say, the estimates may vary, but I would argue that maybe 75-80% of all the US project pipeline, in terms of the volume for sure, like sitting there on the Gulf Coast. As you are leading Texas Hydrogen Alliance and just emerged out of the session with legislators, I wonder, what economic benefits you talked about when you present your case to the legislators, and what kind of discussions are happening in Texas around this uncertainties that we just discussed with other panelists, and what is an overall thinking that is emerging. If you could share your observations and thoughts on that, I would be much appreciated. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for this opportunity. I wish I could say that we have a really positive light right now. Texas legislation is still in session, but it's only for a couple more weeks. And we've seen a session that we had the most bills filed ever in general, and probably we're going to have the least amount of numbers of bills passed this session than any other session. So it's an interesting time in Texas. I mean, obviously, we have a strong hydrogen industry to begin with. The uncertainty is not helping that situation. However, I still think we will fare well in Texas just because of the low cost of renewables, as well as our abundance of natural gas. So having said that, at the state level, we were not successful in passing our handful of our bills. However, we do have a great opportunity in the next year and a half, because we don't go into session again, or we do not go back into session until January of 2027. But there was a bill that was HB 5600, which was a great overall tax incentive bill, ranging from a variety of tax credits and implications. And so I think our goal in Texas is, with this uncertainty of 45V and all the IRA credits, is the next year and a half, we're really going to have to turn inward at the state level and try to flush out some credits and some incentives for this industry. I do believe that we're seeing kind of a shift right now. A lot of blue ammonia projects, like y'all mentioned, being key projects moving forward. We have a lot of work to do on the port side of things, so that's going to be an avenue that I believe that we'll be looking in and exploring for regulations and incentives there. So like I said, we're still in session. There's still a couple of very anti-renewable bills out there that we're working to make sure that they don't cause more harm to this industry. I just wish I had better news from our side of things. However, I will say we still have our $16 million program that's under the Texas Commission of Environmental Quality for vehicles and for infrastructure. That is still there, and that will be funded. So, it's not like IRA where we take, 2 steps back. We might have just not made any movement forward, but we may have not lost any ground either. So I'll kind of leave it there for now.
Yeah, and to put a positive spin on that, I think you summarized it very well. I mean, you're not making steps back, so maybe you're not moving forward, but I would also say it was encouraging to see that there was this bill right on the agenda and legislators considered it, because that's something, the discussion has started, and something that, you can build upon in, as you said, in the next 1.5 years. I'm highlighting that because I think one of the things that our report, I think, was stressing and is stressing is that, hey, alongside market-based mechanisms, the state level action will be crucially important. And with that, I would like to turn to Shannon and talk a little bit about what's going on the West Coast and in the state of Washington, and what is Washington's vision for hydrogen role in its energy system, and what concrete steps the state of Washington is taking to stimulate investments, and how it, maybe more broadly, Shannon, the policymakers and the government in your state is thinking about the future.
So to give folks a bit of a context as to the policy landscape in Washington, I would say we have three big state bills that are really influential in how we think about clean energy and specifically the role of hydrogen. And so first we have our Clean Energy Transformation Act, which commits the state to achieve a carbon-free electricity supply by 2045. We have the Climate Commitment Act, which commits the state to achieve net zero emissions economy-wide by 2050, and sets up a specific cap for the state's biggest emitters and establishes a credit trading program for compliance. And then lastly, we have our Clean Fuel Standard, which requires transportation fuel suppliers incrementally reduce the carbon intensity of fuels throughout a process that's done through rulemaking, and also establishes a credit market for compliance. So those sort of three big things on the table. We are certainly thinking first and foremost about specifically green electrolytic hydrogen and hydrogen that's produced using renewable energy inputs and feedstocks as a very important part in achieving our state decarbonization goals. And I would even say hydrogen in the state of Washington is quite, it elicits quite bipartisan interest, both from the perspective of decarbonization and also as an economic development opportunity. And so a couple years ago, the state legislature asked our Office of Renewable Fuels to conduct a study and publish a report specifically assessing what role we see green electrolytic and renewable hydrogen playing in the state. And specifically, look into what we see demand to be and make policy recommendations to help sort of accelerate that. And I would definitely say that the big framing for that report is like the MO of the state is very much electrify first. We're really narrowly and strategically thinking about green and renewable hydrogen as an opportunity to decarb our hardest to decarb sectors. So wanted to sort of put that out there first, and very much in line with, I think, some of what the other speakers have said about really focusing on strategic applications and end uses. But just to give folks an idea of sort of some of the high level findings of that report, we definitely see Washington as being hungry or thirsty for hydrogen. Our modeling predicted specifically that we expect to see about 0.22 exajoules of demand for green hydrogen and green and renewably generated alternative fuels by 2030 and about 0.27 exajoules by 2050. We don't anticipate that we will be able to produce all of that hydrogen and hydrogen-derived fuels in the state. We do expect that we will have to import, especially closer towards 2050, like a big chunk of that. But when thinking specifically about the portion that is to be or expected to be produced in the state, we would need our renewable electricity capacity to grow by about 2.4 gigawatts by 2030 and 36.8 gigawatts by 2050. So that is no small feat. But another sort of big finding in the report are some of these key applications and sectors that we see as being really big for demand are very much first and foremost, and in the near term, petroleum refining. We have 5 oil refineries in the state of Washington, and those refineries starting pretty soon, we'll have to start thinking about how they will comply with the Climate Commitment Act. And we see that as being a really strong market driver in the near term. And some of the other big categories are certainly heavy duty transportation. We see heavy duty trucking and transit buses being really big in the near term as well. And also very much maritime, aviation fuels, and rail. We also see some demand popping up in the industrial decarb space, both for industrial heat production and also production of bulk chemicals. And lastly, we see hydrogen playing a role in peak power generation, so displacing fossil peaker facilities. And I think a couple other things that we've seen crop up in project plans that are currently being talked about or happening in the state are green fertilizer production. There's a project in the Pacific Northwest Hydrogen Hub that is planning to do that. I think we've heard of some big companies in Washington using hydrogen-powered forklifts in their warehouses and delivery trucks. And then lastly, we know of some utilities that are thinking about and talking about hydrogen blending in the natural gas system. And so in terms of what we're doing, certainly as was already highlighted from a few different perspectives, we are very much in a period of uncertainty. And I think, we're certainly in a moment where we are going to be rethinking the role of the state in helping advance the market regionally, given all the changes happening at the federal level. But some foundational actions that we've done over the past couple of years, I think a big thing for us was granting statutory authority to public transit agencies and municipalities to produce, sell, and use green electrolytic and renewable hydrogen. A lot of those entities are subject to decarbonization mandates for their fleets. And so we saw those as being like really first key movers. And we were approached by public utility districts and other public agencies a few years ago, the legislature was, and they said, we want to be able to do this, make it and use it. And so please, give us the power to do so. So we did that. We included hydrogen, specifically green and renewable, in a lot of our state grant and incentive programs that sort of already exist under wider clean energy umbrellas. We added those projects in. And lastly, we were a really big key player in standing up the Pacific Northwest Hydrogen Association, which is the entity that leads our regional clean hydrogen hub. We also have invested a lot of money and staff capacity into a variety of projects that we see as being really broadly supportive of growing a market in our state. A couple examples are we're right now funding a project to develop an environmental justice toolkit for hydrogen project developers that want to come to Washington from either outside of the state or outside of the country, and give them the tools that will be very helpful in them successfully doing both community and tribal engagement and thinking about community benefits. And lastly, we're already, our legislative session for this past year just ended about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and we're already starting to think about next year and beyond. And so one thing that we're, I think, going to spend a lot of time talking about this summer is specifically hydrogen refueling in the state for medium and heavy duty vehicles. Right now, there's not really the processes or standards set up to certify stations and test fuel quality. And so that's something that us and our neighbors to the south in Oregon are doing a lot of thinking and talking about, learning from California and sort of figuring out what we can do to help usher that in from our side of things.
Well, thank you, Shannon. That was a lot. I mean, in terms of action and what's happening in the state of Washington. So I would like to circle then and go back to project developers and Matt, to you as we started with you. Just heard from Shannon, how much efforts the state of Washington is putting into doing various things to stimulate demand. I guess the question for you here is what are the demand side signals or policies you see as a project developer, making the biggest difference, for project bankability, and perhaps, I just fully appreciate that they might be quite, sector specific. So if you like to choose some sectors, up to you, or, you could say, well, what the state of Washington is doing is a blueprint for every other state. I think it will be good to hear your reflections on, how you would think about, the role of the states in stimulating demand.
Yeah, I think, again, I'm going to start with clarity, understanding just clarity of what the state or whatever jurisdiction wants, is trying to accomplish, I think is really important. And then it's our job as developers and the private sector to try to provide that. I think in terms of, you mentioned the term bankability, the way I view it for a clean hydrogen project, any energy infrastructure project really, but for clean hydrogen to be financed, it has to have long-term contracted revenues. There's no merchant revenues for hydrogen. It's a key difference to, let's compare to natural gas and even power, right? There's no ERCOT or PJM equivalent from a wholesale power perspective, nor is there a Henry Hub or other types of natural gas pricing mechanisms. So hydrogen really has to be a bilateral contract with the customer and a physical delivery of that molecule. So it really has to be long-term fixed price contracts with those customers. Okay, so then the question is, how do you get those, right? Why would a customer sign up for that, right? If you can save them money, great. That's certainly one that makes it easier. If you can provide them a better, more resilient solution, that's another reason. And then compliance or willingness to pay the green premium. And I think the last one there is really where these state level policies come into play. And I think Shannon mentioned the CCA, the Climate Commitment Act. Programs like that go after the full decarbonization of the economy or society in that particular state, I think are really important. And if done well, right, they should be tech agnostic. They shouldn't pick winners or losers. And that's where it's on us as industry to say, okay, hydrogen might not even be mentioned, right? I don't think hydrogen is mentioned in the CCA once, but that's a huge policy driver for hydrogen, because for certain industries, it's going to be the only way that they actually get to be decarbonized. Other states have similar programs, right? Washington's neighbor to the south, Oregon has the Climate Protection Plan, which is similar, right? So et cetera. So we're seeing more and more policies like that. The way I kind of look at it is, and I've been in the power sector here for a little over a decade in renewables before I got into green hydrogen. Lots of RPS or renewable portfolio standards, right, have been coming out over the last several decades. Then we kind of started seeing, so that decarbonizes the power sector. Then we started seeing transportation, where you have the California LCFS, and now, again, Oregon and Washington both have clean fuel standards as well, and other states are looking at that, New Mexico, et cetera. And then you're getting to kind of the full picture with other industry. And so we're definitely seeing that evolution to get to that full decarbonization. And as far as I'm concerned, let's let all technologies compete on a level playing field, and hydrogen is going to win in certain applications where it makes sense, and it's not going to win in other applications, and it shouldn't compete there. So I think the state level, especially given the current federal administration, we saw this in the Trump 1.0 administration as well, it really is time for states to step up and provide that signal of clarity, and then the projects will follow suit.
Thanks, man. That's again, very clear. Maybe Shannon, I'll let you respond or reflect very quickly, and then ask Susan to do the same. What do you think, like, are the elements of the strategy that your state is pursuing that can be replicated in other states? I think Matt referred to a few things, like, hey, having this high level clarity about, around what the state wants, and probably is one of them. But then, what do you think is unique about what you are doing in Washington that may be just unique to Washington? If you could just say a few words about that.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to start with what feels sort of unique to Washington. And I would say all of these aren't intended to be exclusive, just sort of like, I think, enabling conditions or characteristics that make our approach make sense for our state. First, I think in terms of just like our ability to do work from the Climate Commitment Act that I mentioned, the state revenue from the auction proceeds provides a lot of money for the state to give grants to pilot projects and other capital investments, as well as gives our Office of Renewable Fuels our budget. So, that is certainly like a unique situation that allows us to do a lot of the work that we're doing that I think would require, it's a co-benefit of the program as it exists, and also is no small lift. So that's, I think, certainly a Washington specific thing. I think also, given our robust suite of decarbonization goals and programs that exist to support the achievement of those, we are pretty laser focused on investing our staff capacity and time and investments in green electrolytic and renewably derived hydrogen and fuels. Not every state is going to take that approach. We have, statutorily defined what it means to us for those two terms, green electrolytic and renewable hydrogen. And it's not tied to carbon intensity. It is like very specifically around renewable energy feedstocks and inputs. So I think that has, sort of historically been in line with how we see hydrogen playing a role in our decarbonization goals, and sort of the what we value out of that. I think also we are certainly focusing on demand sectors or even like opportunities to further create value add products that make sense for our economy. And so, there's a big aviation sector in Washington, a big maritime sector, and our legislature is very excited about those as applications. And so we're also spending a lot of time and investments looking specifically into SAF and green ammonia. And I would say lastly, a sort of Washington specific thing is that, we share an international border with Canada. Our neighbors to the north is the province of British Columbia. And we have fairly well aligned climate policies and, jurisdictional priorities. And so something we've been working on for the last year as well is we partnered with the British Columbia Clean Energy Major Projects Office and the Pacific Northwest Economic Region specifically to do a study and a recommendation report looking into how we can work better together as neighbors over this international border to make the movement of hydrogen products, technologies, and business interactions easier. And so, we're trying to zoom out a little bit and take more of a regional approach and think a bit about the international trade opportunity that exists for us, given that we are a border state. But I think in terms of things that other jurisdictions could be well positioned to do as well, I think first and foremost, looking at unique opportunities for tax incentives or other types of incentives and grants specifically to drive demand in the sectors that make sense for a given state. We currently have a state sales and use tax deferral for green and renewable hydrogen production facilities that meet specific labor and community benefit standards. And we're starting to think about other types of tax incentives, specifically on the demand side. Other states, have their own tax incentives. There's some in Colorado and California, and I believe Texas as well might have some, at least on the front of fuel cell electric vehicles. So that's certainly something that I think other jurisdictions could explore. I also think in some of the more supportive actions, public-private partnerships are always an interesting opportunity for government to partner up with the private sector to try to spur project development. I think there are a lot of opportunities for states to join multi-state efforts that are funded either federally or otherwise. Washington, we're a partner in a federally funded project that includes, as pilot states, Washington, Utah, and Connecticut, specifically to develop hydrogen workforce training for folks that get trained at the 2-year technical college and union apprenticeship level. And so we've joined in on that effort with a couple of other states across the US. And lastly, I think especially if there is like, an absence of state funding, I think there's a lot of opportunities to be creative and just fostering relationships with industry and building coalitions, working with industry associations, and just sort of trying to play that role of convener and collaborator. Like I said, especially if there is an absence of like targeted state investments.
Again, very, very comprehensive. Maybe I'll go then next to Susan and we'll ask a similar question. Susan, as you listen to Shannon's story, I guess the question here is like, yes, there are things that are probably unique to the state of Washington and, wouldn't apply or wouldn't be, possible in Texas in terms of the approach. But as you are emerging out of this session with legislators, which still has to be concluded, of course, how do you think about it in terms of what Texas state policymakers could do to drive growth in the hydrogen industry? Is that like reintroducing HB 5600 in 1.5 years, or there are some other things that can be done to accelerate investments across the value chain?
So I think the biggest thing, I mean, obviously Texas is pro-business, period. And we thrive on, or we like to promote that we don't have the extreme regulatory environment like other states do. And we will most likely never have extreme regulatory mandates. So, I mean, that takes a huge chunk of incentive out. When I say incentive, or just a requirement to move forward. We've had to change our language, obviously, somewhat. I mean, we talk about energy expansion, not transition. We talk about energy dominance now and continue our dominance. The biggest thing in Texas, there's really two things, is the legislatures like to see job growth. And so the job growth story is what we really need to focus on. We really need to show the economics of these projects and what it means to Texas if these projects do go away. That is key, and that's a message that we are really needing to push among our legislators. The other thing is we're a state of, we don't like subsidies, unfortunately. And so if there's fiscal notes on legislation, that does not go over well. And so that's something that we really have to work on. This HB 5600, it was a very late minute bill that was introduced by a freshman. I think it's a great framework we're going to have and be able to get through it. But it had a very large fiscal note tied to it. And the fiscal note that it was tied to was all for workforce development. So, the benefit of Texas is we do have large oil and gas, which a lot of those jobs can cross over and move over into the hydrogen space. So we see that. It's just getting this information out. And unfortunately, like I said, it wasn't just a hydrogen issue this year. It was an everything issue this year again. So, we have a lot of work to do here. As mentioned, we still have our TCEQ funding. There is some federal sales tax or a sales tax exemption on vehicles in Texas that is very, it's tucked deep down in the weeds in some of our tax code, but that's there. And I think as long as we can portray the story of the jobs creations, the ancillary services that the industry would bring to our communities, and just overall the economic growth and what it means to our state, that's our message. And that's how we're going to have to go about it. We can't go about it as far as mandates and subsidies, because that's just not going to be heard.
Got it. Thank you, Susan. I think the approach is clear. I think I guess the nitty-gritties have to be, fleshed out in the coming 1.5 years, as you said. And probably we'll get to you in a minute as we are concluding this round, but we've discussed a lot the state level action. I maybe would like to turn to you, Tessa, first before we go to Amy, and just give you an opportunity to share some of the reflections about how you think in RMI about the market-based mechanisms and how they can complement either the state level action or federal level action, and what is their role more broadly in shaping this ecosystem. So if you could say a few words about that, and then we'll go to Amy.
Thanks, Alexi. Yeah, we view market mechanisms, so being, as I referred to in my presentation, kind of buyers alliances, which can pull together a set of potential buyers of hydrogen into a pooled demand that together is large enough to justify the supply side investment in the facility as being one example of a market mechanism, or what we call book and claim systems or other kind of chain of custody models, which essentially can help address some of the very near-term and early challenges in building markets around kind of the physical locations where we might be seeing more momentum and more investments in new decarbonized plants to be physically decoupled from the buyers and the locations of the buyers who may want to pay for that. We see that market mechanisms are important in helping to address some of the early challenges around building markets, be it that individually these buyers don't have enough demand, say, to justify investments. We see, say, automobile off-takers for steel who can justify demand in new hydrogen-based DRIs. Individually, say each one of those automobile companies or each one of the construction companies alone doesn't have the demand. Together they can, and together they can send a strong demand signal. Or we see that in complex value chains that are multi-step, where some of these downstream corporate buyers who want to claim the emissions reduction certifications to help provide progress on their sustainability targets as a company can translate that willingness to pay into the part of the value chain that needs to outlay the direct costs. So for example, We can say in the world of maritime shipping, the cargo movers, the companies like the IKEAs of the Amazons of the world that are moving cargo, they care about reducing their Scope 3 sustainability commitments from voluntary action. It enables them to then translate a willingness to pay back to the fleet operators who need to pay themselves and kind of make the supply side investments in fuels. And it enables a physical decoupling and traceability of emissions throughout the supply chain. So we see that systems of that sort really provide these just early solutions to help get past some of the challenges that we see in fragmentation and complexity of supply chains, but we don't see them as tools that can really help motivate purchasing at scale, given the significant cost gaps that we sometimes observe for clean fuel adoption. There may not be enough business case, and as Matt, you've outlined, right? Oftentimes that buyer-based willingness to pay a premium is not there. And in order to create more of a push for purchasing of the clean fuels, the clean products that hydrogen can produce, that policy-backed support really provides the driving force, and the market mechanisms can provide that complement and more of the physical tool that help enables these first transactions and deals to be done.
Yeah, that's well summarized, Tessa. In the end, I would say that these mechanisms are not insignificant. Take, $300 million of green premiums generated in the last round by Sustainable Aviation Buyers Alliance. I would say that's pretty significant, but still, these mechanisms are allowing and enabling the front runners to maybe pencil out the first, commercial scale projects, but cannot move, the whole market at the scale and speed, that is needed. Therefore, policy action, be it at the state level or federal, remains critical. And maybe that's a good transition point to you, Amy, and you could reflect on this very question and how you think about the future of ESAF, right, which is like the next, I would say, frontier of the sustainable aviation fuel. What is going to happen if 45V would disappear in that scenario? What would you think about it? Is that kind of might be the end of the project, or you could still see an opportunity where you could tap into some of this, LCFS-driven demand at the state level, or maybe market-based mechanism, and still, make your projects work? Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I think that the demand for ESAF in the US is very low, right? So the airlines and freight carriers of the world that use aviation fuel, are willing to pay a small premium that they can pass on to their customers for, carbon reduced fuels. But ESAF, where it's almost a near 100% carbon emission reduction, it is more expensive on a unit basis, and we don't see a willingness to pay. So we do see a willingness to pay in Europe, mainly because of the mandates, because the penalties are much higher than just paying the green premium for the fuel. And so I think that's where the market will develop. I mean, hopefully over time it will also develop in the US, but we don't see that in the short term. So what you see now is there are a couple producers in the US producing ESAF, and they're exporting it into Europe. And if the, tax credits go away, probably product won't be made in Europe. I mean, won't be made in the US at all. It will just be made in other places where there's lower cost electricity or have better incentives. So I think that's kind of the reality, unfortunately, of what could happen. I think it's very encouraging to hear some of the things that Washington State is doing. And, our project in the US is in Texas, mainly because of the way the renewable electricity and grid situation was worked out well for us here. But I think that, states will have to step up if we want to see US production of ESAF. And it's going to be a long way to go to get there, right? So I think it's really encouraging to see what Washington's doing. Of course, California also has some friendly incentives as well, but it's more challenging to actually have a production facility in California, right? So there's other trade-offs there, here and there. So I would expect that ESAF will be made because there is a demand in Europe, there is a demand in the UK, so it will be made. Would love to see some of that taking place in the US, but if not, it'll be made elsewhere.
Got it. So I think we are approaching the end. I think we have 10 minutes left. I would like to ask everyone one question, just to synthesize, and maybe reflect on what we've discussed here today. And, maybe in a couple of sentences, if you could synthesize what is the most important action, for US policy and industry leaders to activate strong domestic US hydrogen market in the coming years. And to give you a minute to think about that, maybe I'll go first to Tessa, because we didn't touch on the midstream infrastructure here. And I know, Tessa, that you've done lots of work on that, and it features prominently into the report too. So maybe, I will impose the answer on you. Can you say a few words on the midstream infrastructure, and then we'll go to everyone else for the final remarks.
Definitely. We see that midstream infrastructure, so hydrogen pipelines or hydrogen storage resources like salt caverns or other underground storage resources, are really essential in helping to provide the resiliency of supply that a lot of off-takers will require in switching to hydrogen. So fossil fuels are able to provide resiliency in that they're nearly always available. If we're thinking about, say, hydrogen based from green hydrogen sources, electrolytic supply reliant on solar and wind, it is inherently a little bit more variable. And we will need something to buffer that supply, especially when we think about these large industrial off-takers who need consistency. So investments in infrastructure we view as being essential to support alongside production, in that you can't decouple them if you're offering essentially a product that an off-taker is willing to purchase. We see that in order to get going, though, midstream is oftentimes notorious of our classic chicken and egg challenge for hydrogen, where you need to have the certainty of supply, you need to have the certainty of offtake, and kind of everything needs to come together all at once. So we view that approaches that focus on kind of planning and alignment around, first, what is necessary? What types of corridors could we see that connect potential supply locations, potential offtake locations, potential storage locations, in order to help incrementally build the market and provide that visibility that can then align all supply chain partners around, okay, we can start to move forward as being an effective first step. And we've seen this as a model that Europe has taken in its European hydrogen backbone approach to infrastructure planning, which is oftentimes now cited hand in hand with nearly every announcement around pipeline development being made, kind of linking back to this European hydrogen backbone, which is providing a kind of de-risked way for a new project to come online and find connections to a diversity of off-takers in a way that the United States would benefit from similar types of regional-based planning approaches.
Yeah, thank you, Tessa. That was a bit longer than 1 to 2 minutes that I expected, but thanks for providing this perspective. There was a question to you. You might have not seen it in the chat, and the question was whether this is when you were talking about infrastructure, whether you were talking about the same infrastructure as blending hydrogen into the natural gas pipelines. And I think the answer to that question is no. I think what we were considering in this report is either retrofitted or new built infrastructure to transport pure hydrogen and store pure hydrogen. Just answered one of the questions which is out there. So final remarks, if you could keep that to 1 to 2 minutes, maybe Matt, starting with you, what are your reflections on what we've discussed today? A few words.
Yeah, I think what I would want to say to policymakers, and just to conclude, is that, right, it's really important to provide a clear signal, whatever that is, and then the industry will respond accordingly. The volatility is not helpful. I was really attracted to clean hydrogen because I still believe it's fundamentally bipartisan. That doesn't mean, right, we'll get one result or another out of the reconciliation bill, but clean hydrogen is fundamentally bipartisan because you have a great coalition of support from renewables, nuclear, waste to hydrogen, RNG, right, CCS, et cetera, natural gas, right? So I think hydrogen supports domestic manufacturing, jobs, key industries that we want to onshore, investment, typically in rural red communities, jobs in those communities, and is really important from a competitiveness perspective for the United States. So I think it really fits in with bipartisan objectives. And we as an industry have to do a better job of conveying those messages to the right policy makers. And in turn, we want clear signals from them.
That's fair. And Shannon, maybe over to you. I think I guess you will agree with everything that Matt just described. But what are your key takeaways?
Yeah, definitely. I think from the perspective of a state that already has like some pretty clear market signals, I feel like the next most important thing is developing policies and investing in capital projects to encourage growth specifically in key demand sectors that make sense for a state's goals and economy, and coordinating those actions with your neighbors. And I guess my, caveat second follow-up sentence would be, we are certainly entering into an era, I think, where even the most climate forward and like bold emission reduction states are probably going to have to rethink a little bit and perhaps, not feel like there's room to be quite as bold. And so, certainly that caveat is, I think we're all going to be thinking about if we're not able to be quite as bold, what are the really, really, really important things that we can be doing to keep ensuring incremental progress, even if it's not as big of a bite?
Very clear. Thanks, Shannon. And maybe Susan, your reflections next.
So I think it comes down to three things: certainty, education, and collaboration. I think every state is going to approach this a little differently, as we've talked about. And I think that we can all learn from each other. A lot of times the way that Washington goes about things is just it's using different verbiage than what we have to use down here, but we can all get to the same point where we need to be. So the education is key once again. And I think right now we need to hear about the projects that are moving forward, the projects that are starting to turn dirt, the projects that we can go to our legislators, federal and state, and say, hey, look, this is happening in your state and this is moving forward. And hydrogen's got a great story to tell. And I think we need to have those projects and be able to move forward and educate our legislators on the benefits, and that, we are a player. We are a viable option for them to consider and for us to be at the table. And I think that's something that, we need to just get better at telling our story.
Thank you, Susan. And Amy, over to you for your final remarks.
Yeah, I think what would really move the needle is, short, medium term subsidies and or grants to producers to lower the cost for their off-takers, right, for their customers. If we look at why we should do this, it's because look at the money that insurance companies are having to spend because of climate change. Look at the money governments are having to spend because of climate change and taking care of things. There is money available. So it's about allocating it to the right places and having a transition so that, we don't have these issues in the future with climate change. And yes, we have to pay a premium in the short term for some of these carbon neutral fuels, but that's how it is. So all these other things are important, but getting the subsidies to the right producers to get the cost down from the beginning makes the difference, in my opinion.
All right. Well, that probably brings us to my final remarks. And I think my main takeaway is that, this could be easily, a bit of a doom and gloom discussion because of, all the uncertainties which are still out there, and in the context of, some of the news in the past couple of weeks that are out there. But I think it was not, right? And I do, believe, after this conversation, that we will see the domestic market in the US developing, maybe not at the scale and pace that some of us have anticipated a while ago, but I think there will be movement, not the least because of the state level actions, because, some of this market-based mechanisms, and some of the federal support that would still be there. And of course, we didn't discuss export today. That is going to happen, right? So while we may say, well, 10 million tons by 2030 clean hydrogen target might be out of reach, but on the spectrum, 2.5 to 7 million tons that we've been looking at, we will find ourselves somewhere there in the middle, hopefully, or maybe even on the higher end. We'll see. Things may change in a year or two, as the global markets would also develop, and that would also determine and impact what is happening in the US market, and what responses will be on the policymaker side. So with that, I would really like to say a big thank you to all the panelists for your optimistic, realistic, pragmatic approach and diverse perspectives that we were expecting, and I think we've got. I also would like to thank everyone who joined us for this webinar on building an American hydrogen market. We were excited to share the work with you. And in terms of the recording, you see the QR code on the screen. The recording will be available within the next 24 hours. So thanks again, and have a wonderful day.